Welcome to the 10th episode of the AfterSessions. David Reimer, the Gender Experiment.
We are told from birth who we are. We are given a name, a gender, and a set of expectations. But what happens when the label the world gives us feels like a cage? What happens when the person in the mirror is a stranger designed by society?
In 1966, a simple medical mistake turned a baby boy's life into a scientific test subject. Based on the belief that we are born as blank slates, a famous psychologist tried to prove that gender is just a costume we learn to wear rather than truth we are born with. At the time, the world called it a scientific breakthrough, the ultimate proof that we are products of our environment, not our biology.
Today, we are looking at the tragic life of David Reimer. His story is a confrontation between ideology and biology. It's a study of what happens when a human being is forced into a narrative that contradicts their purpose. We are exploring the ethics of nurture, the weight of secrets, and the resilience of the true self.
Born as Bruce Reimer in 1965 in Winnipeg, Manitoba, at the age of 6 months, both he and his identical twin Brian were diagnosed with phimosis, a condition affecting the genitals. The result of an incorrect circumcision performed by Reimer's physician was the permanent damaging of his genitals. So Reimer's parents met Dr. John Money, a psychologist at Johns Hopkins Hospital. Dr. Money believed that gender was a societal construct, malleable from an early age, suggesting that children are born psychosexually neutral and that their gender identity is shaped entirely by how they are raised before the age of 2.
And so Reimer was subjected to sexual assignment surgery. Basically, Reimer was raised as a girl. Bruce became Brenda. He also received estrogen during adolescence to promote his development as a girl. Sadly, over time, Dr. Money's methods became much more extreme. His treatment involved forced sexual interactions between the twins, and Reimer recounted anger and verbal abuse from the psychologist if he or his brother resisted orders. Reimer's case became famously known as the John Joan case, leaving out his real name. But Dr. Money's theory ignored the biological determinism of the brain, the prenatal hormones and chromosomal blueprints that wire our sense of self long before we can speak.
But this makes us think how big a risk gambling on someone's identity can be. And is it ethically correct if the person affected has no control over it? Dr. Money's gamble was based on neuroplasticity. He believed the infant brain was plastic enough to be molded into any shape. But as Reimer grew, the mold began to crack. He had female hormones and wore dresses, but he always felt like a boy, a profound, nameless disconnect from the person he saw in the mirror.
What makes this case particularly troubling is that despite Reimer's clear and consistent distress, his resistance to female roles, his discomfort, his behavioral signals, John Money still went on to publish the case as a successful outcome.
So he essentially disregarded evidence that contradicted his hypothesis.
Exactly. His reports presented the transition as smooth and effective, reinforcing his theory, while the lived reality was far more complex. Reimer was experiencing significant psychological strain, social withdrawal, confusion, and a deep sense of misalignment.
That raises serious ethical concerns about the misrepresentation of someone's lived experience.
From a psychological perspective, this aligns closely with confirmation bias. Money appears to have selectively focused on evidence that supported his pre existing beliefs, while minimizing or overlooking contradictory data. And it's worth noting, this case was widely cited at the time as key evidence in the nature versus nurture debate on gender identity.
And importantly, Reimer's experiences are now understood in terms of gender dysphoria, a condition characterized by significant distress arising from incongruence between one's biological sex and gender identity. Later in life, after learning the truth, Reimer transitioned back to living as a male, taking the name David Reimer.
What intensifies this situation is that Reimer was unaware of the truth about his biological origins, which likely compounded his confusion and delayed any possibility of resolving that internal conflict. Without that awareness, he lacked the framework to make sense of his internal experiences. This results in what psychologists refer to as cognitive dissonance, a persistent psychological tension between internal identity and external expectations.
And when that dissonance remains unresolved over time, it can lead to significant emotional and psychological instability, which in this case is exactly what we observe: long term trauma, depression, and lasting psychological consequences that extend well into adulthood.
At age 15, Reimer's father finally told him the truth. Following that revelation, Reimer assumed a male identity, taking the first name David. By age 21, Reimer had received testosterone therapy and surgeries to assume a biologically male identity.
This is a powerful demonstration of essentialism, which showed that despite a decade of intense social conditioning, David's internal map of his gender remained male. His internal essence defined his actual identity. It suggests there are core parts of the human psyche that are immutable, which is that they cannot be taught away. His transition back to David was an act of self actualization, a desperate reach for authenticity, independence, and personal growth.
David eventually married Jane Fontaine, a single mother of three, in 1990 and became a stepfather, trying to build the life that had been intercepted. In the mid 1990s, Reimer met Milton Diamond, a psychologist in Hawaii and an academic rival of money. Reimer participated in a follow up study conducted by Diamond, in which Diamond catalogued the failures of Reimer's transition. Eventually, he went public with his story to stop other children from being subjected to similar experiments. He described his interactions with money as torturous and abusive, developing a lifelong distrust for hospitals and medical professionals.
But the scars of the experiment ran deep. The trauma didn't just affect David, it rippled through his entire family. His twin brother, Brian Reimer, struggled with the fallout for years, suffering from depression and schizophrenia, and eventually died from an antidepressant drug overdose in 2002. The weight of that loss, along with years of medical intervention and emotional strain, became overwhelming. So it raises a difficult question. Can the impact of early psychological trauma ever truly be undone?
In his early 20s, Reimer attempted to commit suicide twice. His adult family life was strained by marital problems and employment difficulties. 2 days after Reimer's wife asked for a divorce in 2004, David Reimer died by suicide. His death stands as a stark reminder of the long term effects of childhood trauma. Even after learning the truth and reclaiming his identity, the cumulative psychological impact of years of coercion, confusion, and distress can leave lasting scars that are incredibly difficult to resolve.
And importantly, his case didn't just end with him, it reshaped an entire field. It forced the medical and psychological community to re-evaluate earlier assumptions about gender identity and adopt more cautious, patient centered approaches.
It also highlighted how long term trauma works, how repeated psychological harm in childhood doesn't simply disappear, but can persist and manifest across adulthood in complex and often unpredictable ways. And in many ways, it exposed the consequences of prioritizing theory over lived experience, showing that identity cannot simply be imposed or reshaped through medical intervention alone.
Which ultimately leaves us with a final question. When scientific ambition overrides ethical responsibility, who bears the cost?
David Reimer was never just a case study or a collection of data points in a dusty textbook. He was a boy who spent 14 years in a silent war, fighting against a world that tried to convince him that his own heart was lying to him.
His life is a haunting reminder that while society can carve a name into stone and hand us a role to play, it cannot manufacture a soul. That inner compass belongs to us alone. It is the only thing the world cannot touch.
We tell his story to honor the boy who refused to be a doctor's footnote. He proved that you can manipulate the environment and you can rewrite the rules, but you cannot delete the truth of a human being. Because while science tries to categorize us into boxes and label our every move,
The human spirit was never meant to be contained.